He couldn't speak. The words caught in his 8-year-old throat as he watched the men in fake maintenance uniforms working beneath the cars. Wrong logo. Wrong movements. Wrong everything. She couldn't know. His mother, Lacey, was inside that restaurant. Flour on her forearms, exhaustion carved into her face from another 14-hour shift pretending to be just a prep cook when she was so much more. He didn't listen to his fear. Every instinct screamed, "Run home, tell Mrs. Chen, call 911," but 8-year-old Dean Bell did something else entirely. He ran toward the danger. She never knew her son was about to throw himself in front of a Maserati owned by the most dangerous man in the city. He never knew that screaming, "Don't get in your cars, there's bombs under all of them," would save a mafia boss's life. What happened next changed everything. Dean's sneakers skidded against rain-slicked asphalt as he threw himself in front of the crimson Maserati, his arms spread wide like he could physically hold back the vehicle, his voice cracking with terror as he screamed words that made the entire street freeze. "Don't get in your cars. There's bombs under all of them." The downtown evening had been pleasant moments before spring air carrying the scent of blooming magnolias from the restaurant's courtyard, mixing with something darker. The metallic tang of fear sweat pouring down a child's face as he positioned his small body between death and the most dangerous man in the city. Orion Pierce emerged from his flagship restaurant's entrance, 6 feet of controlled violence in a midnight blue suit, dark eyes locking onto the child, blocking his vehicle with the kind of suicidal courage that made his hand instinctively move toward the weapon concealed beneath his perfectly tailored jacket. 4 armed men in tactical positions stepped forward, their bodies creating a lethal barrier between Orion and whatever threat this child represented. The boy didn't flinch. "I saw the men." Dean's voice rose higher, more frantic, his chest heaving as he tried to make them understand. They weren't real maintenance workers. The city doesn't use that kind of van, and they were working too fast. Like they were scared someone would see them. His words tumbled out in gasping fragments, terror making him stumble over syllables as tears cut tracks through the dirt smudged across his face. Orion raised one hand, a single gesture that froze his security detail mid-motion, years of training overridden by a command they'd learned never to question. He studied the boy with the same calculating intensity he applied to hostile takeovers and territorial negotiations, cataloging details that others would dismiss. The sketchbook clutched in white-knuckled hands showing detailed architectural drawings, the grass stains on knees suggesting he'd been lying flat, hidden, watching from ground level. The specific, technical panic in eyes that had witnessed something genuinely catastrophic. This wasn't a prank. This child believed every word erupting from his mouth with the absolute certainty of someone who'd seen death being installed beneath expensive machinery. "What's your name?" Orion's voice was unexpectedly gentle as he crouched to the boy's eye level despite the expensive suit, despite his head of security's visible discomfort. Dean wiped his nose with the back of his hand, trying to steady his breathing enough to speak clearly. "Dean, sir. Dean Bell. I was sketching the building's foundation. My mom's an architect. She teaches me about load-bearing structures when I saw them." His finger pointed toward the line of parked vehicles with trembling accuracy that made Orion's blood run cold. 2 men in city maintenance uniforms, but the logo was wrong. It's supposed to have the bridge on the left side, not the right, and they had the access panel open on your car for way too long. Too long for checking tire pressure or whatever they were supposed to be doing. Marcus Orion's head of security, a former Special Forces operative, was already moving before the words finished leaving Dean's mouth. The man spoke rapid commands into his radio, summoning their explosives specialist while simultaneously establishing a hard perimeter, his team creating a human wall blocking civilian access to the vehicles. How long ago? Orion's question was sharp, professional, already calculating timelines and blast radiuses if this situation escalated from critical to catastrophic. Dean's eyes darted to the bank's digital clock visible above the restaurant's entrance, his young mind struggling to translate observation into useful tactical information. "Maybe 45 minutes? I had to finish my sketch first so I could show you exactly where they were standing, and then I ran all the way here, but I had to wait for the crossing guard at Jefferson Street because Mom says I'm not allowed to cross busy streets alone." The admission hit Orion like a physical blow to the solar plexus. This child had witnessed trained operatives planting what were likely vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, sophisticated enough to target multiple cars simultaneously, and his first instinct hadn't been to run home to safety or find a police officer. Instead, he'd stayed long enough to document positions, to gather evidence, then raced directly into the kill zone to warn people he'd never met. Marcus's voice crackled through the comm unit in Orion's ear, confirmation that made every muscle in his body go rigid with controlled fury. 4 devices, professionally installed. Remote detonation capability with line-of-sight trigger requirement. Military-grade composition. We're looking at complete elimination of anyone within 20 feet of these vehicles, plus secondary fragmentation that would have taken out the restaurant's front entrance. Whoever planned this wanted you and everyone near you erased. Without this child's warning, Orion and his 3 top lieutenants would have been reduced to unidentifiable remains scattered across downtown pavement, their empire left leaderless and vulnerable to immediate hostile takeover. 18 years of careful planning, 4 years of consolidation, his entire legacy saved by an 8-year-old boy with a sketchbook and an architect's eye for details that didn't belong. Orion stood, his hand briefly touching Dean's shoulder in a gesture that surprised even himself. "You did good, Dean. Better than good. You saved my life. You saved all of our lives." Dean's eyes widened, surprise replacing terror for just a moment. Adults rarely spoke to him with that kind of respect, that suggestion he'd done something genuinely important rather than just being in the way. But then Dean's expression shifted, that brief moment of pride crumbling back into panic. "Sir, I can't leave. Not yet. My mom, she's still inside. She's working tonight. And if something goes wrong, if they have more bombs or if they're watching to make sure everyone dies." His voice cracked again, this time not from fear but from the weight of responsibility no child should carry. "She's all I have. She doesn't know about any of this. Someone has to tell her it's not safe. Someone has to make sure she gets out." Orion felt something cold settle in his chest, the kind of calculation that had kept him alive this long finally clicking into place. This wasn't random. A child who understood architectural details, who could identify false city logos and tactical positioning, whose mother worked at his restaurant and was apparently all the family this boy had that wasn't coincidence. That was either the most elaborate setup he'd ever encountered, or something far more interesting. "Your mother works here?" Orion's voice had shifted, losing the gentleness, becoming the tone that made grown men reconsider their life choices. "What's her name?" "Lacey Bell, sir. She's in the kitchen. She's one of the prep cooks, but she's really an architect. She just does this for the extra money because we have bills, and she says architects don't make enough to deans." Words were tumbling out too fast. The way children explained things when they were scared adults would stop listening, would decide their problems weren't important enough to matter. Orion's mind was already moving 3 steps ahead, seeing the board, understanding the game. Marcus was approaching with the kind of careful expression that meant he'd heard enough of the conversation to understand this situation had just become exponentially more complicated. "The boy's not leaving without his mother," Orion said quietly, making it a statement rather than asking permission from his own security chief. "And I'm not letting either of them out of my sight until I understand why a prep cook's 8-year-old son just happened to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to save my life. That's not luck, Marcus. That's something else." Dean's small hand suddenly grabbed Orion's jacket sleeve, his fingers twisting in the expensive fabric with desperate strength. "She didn't do anything wrong. My mom would never hurt anyone. She just works here because we need the money. And she doesn't even know I saw the men. I didn't tell her because I knew she'd be scared and try to handle it herself. And she always says I need to let adults deal with adult problems. But sometimes adults don't see what I see, and—" "Dean." Orion crouched again, bringing himself back to eye level, his voice cutting through the boy's spiraling panic with surgical precision. "I believe you, but I need to talk to your mother. I need to understand why you were here, why you were watching, and why she might need extra money badly enough to work a job she's overqualified for. Can you understand that?" Dean nodded slowly, tears still tracking down his face, but something in Orion's tone had reached him, the promise of investigation rather than accusation, of protection rather than punishment. "You're going to keep us safe?" Orion found himself making a promise he hadn't intended, one that would complicate everything that came next, that would draw a line in his carefully controlled world he couldn't uncross. But looking at this 8-year-old boy who'd run toward death to save strangers, who was now more worried about his mother than himself, Orion heard himself say words that would change everything. "I'm going to keep you both safe. You have my word." And in Orion Pierce's world, that word was the only contract that truly mattered, the one he'd never, in 18 years at his father's side and 4 years at the top, ever broken. Not even once. Lacey Bell emerged from the kitchen's service entrance with flour dusting her forearms and exhaustion carved into every line of her face, her eyes immediately finding Dean in the crowd of security personnel and emergency responders. The relief that flooded her expression lasted exactly 3 seconds before she registered the bomb disposal unit, the perimeter tape, and her 8-year-old son standing next to a man whose photograph she'd seen in newspapers with headlines that used words like alleged and syndicate and untouchable. Her first instinct was maternal and immediate. She crossed the distance in seconds, pulling Dean against her body with fierce protectiveness, her hands already checking him for injuries, even as her mind tried to process why Orion Pierce was watching this reunion, with the kind of focused attention that made her skin prickle with warnings. Her hindbrain recognized, even if she couldn't articulate them. "Dean, what did you do?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but Orion heard the question beneath the question. "What have you gotten us into?" Dean's explanation came in rushed fragments about maintenance workers and wrong logos and bombs under cars, and Lacey felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she understood that her son had just saved the life of the most dangerous man in the city, which meant they were now entangled in something she'd spent 8 years carefully avoiding. She'd taken the prep cook position specifically because it was low profile, because no one noticed the help, because she could work late shifts when Dean was supposed to be safely home with their elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen, not running through downtown streets toward explosions that hadn't happened yet because her brilliant, observant, too brave child couldn't stand by and let people die. Orion's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts with surgical precision. "Mrs. Bell, I need you to come with me. Now. Somewhere private where we can discuss why your son was in a position to observe a professional hit being set up on my vehicles." It wasn't a request. Wasn't even really a command. It was simply a statement of what was going to happen next, delivered in a tone that suggested refusal wasn't actually an option available to her. Marcus materialized at Orion's shoulder with the kind of timing that suggested he'd been waiting for precisely this cue, gesturing toward a black SUV that definitely wasn't one of the vehicles currently surrounded by bomb disposal experts. Lacey's first instinct was to refuse, to grab Dean and run, to pretend they could somehow walk away from this moment and return to their carefully constructed life of anonymity and survival. But Dean's hand tightened in hers, and when she looked down, she saw not fear in his eyes, but something worse: trust. Her son trusted this man, which meant he'd already formed the kind of bond that came from shared danger, from being seen and validated in ways that 8-year-old boys who were too smart for their own good desperately needed. The drive lasted 12 minutes through streets that grew progressively quieter, more exclusive, until they pulled through gates that required 3 separate security checkpoints and entered a property that looked like it belonged on magazine covers about architectural digest perfection. Orion's home office was all dark wood and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking gardens that were probably maintained by people who earned more than she made in 6 months of kitchen work. He dismissed Marcus with a gesture, leaving the 3 of them alone in a space that felt simultaneously too large and suffocatingly intimate. And Lacey forced herself to meet his eyes directly, refusing to be cowed even though every survival instinct she'd developed over 8 years of single motherhood was screaming that this man could destroy them with a phone call. "Why was Dean watching my restaurant?" Orion's question was deceptively simple, but Lacey heard the layers beneath it, the implication that she'd somehow set this up, that her son's heroism was actually reconnaissance for someone else's operation. The accusation ignited something in her chest that burned hotter than fear. Righteous fury at the suggestion that she would ever put her child in danger for any reason, much less for the kind of underworld politics that got people disappeared. She'd spent 8 years keeping them invisible specifically to avoid this kind of attention, this kind of entanglement with men who solved problems with violence instead of blueprints and load calculations. "He wasn't watching your restaurant," Lacey said, her voice steady despite the way her hands were shaking. "He was sketching architectural elements for a school project because I'm teaching him to see buildings the way I do, as mathematical problems with aesthetic solutions. We live 3 blocks from here, and your restaurant has beautiful facade work that demonstrates classical proportions. He's 8 years old, and his idea of a good time is analyzing foundation stress points, not spying on organized crime figures." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. 14-hour shifts and constant fear making her reckless, making her forget that you didn't talk back to men like Orion Pierce. You didn't challenge them. You certainly didn't imply they were paranoid for questioning why a child might be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But instead of anger, she saw something shift in Orion's expression, a calculation happening behind those dark eyes that made her even more nervous than his suspicion had. "You're an architect," he said slowly. "And it wasn't a question. But you work in my kitchen as a prep cook. Why?" The question was a trap, Lacey knew, because any answer that explained the massive gap between her credentials and her current employment would reveal the kind of desperation that men like Orion could exploit. But Dean was watching her with those serious eyes that missed nothing, and she'd never lied to her son about the realities of their life, had never pretended their situation was anything other than what it was: precarious, temporary, built on compromises that kept them fed but not safe, surviving but not living. Because architects who piss off the wrong people don't get hired by legitimate firms, Lacey said quietly, each word costing her something. Because 3 years ago I made the mistake of filing a formal complaint about code violations in a commercial development project, and the developer who ignored my recommendations turned out to be connected to someone named Victor Castellano. Because when that building's parking structure partially collapsed 6 months later and injured 4 people, I testified that I'd warned them about the load-bearing calculations being wrong. Because Victor doesn't forgive people who make him look bad in court, and suddenly I couldn't get hired anywhere except cash under the table, jobs that don't ask questions, or require background checks. She watched Orion's expression change as he processed this information, saw the moment he made connections she hadn't intended to reveal. Victor Castellano, he repeated softly, dangerously. The same Victor who's been trying to move product through shell construction companies. The same Victor who owns that abandoned mill on the east side that city inspectors somehow never quite managed to examine thoroughly. His eyes were locked on hers now with laser focus. The same Victor who would have very good reason to want me dead, since I've been systematically shutting down his distribution network for the past 18 months. Lacey felt ice flood her veins as understanding crashed over her. The maintenance workers Dean had seen, the professional setup, the timing. This wasn't random violence. This was strategic elimination. And she'd inadvertently put herself and Dean directly in the crossfire of a war between 2 men who operated according to rules that had nothing to do with legal systems or moral considerations. I don't work for Victor, she said urgently, needing Orion to believe this one crucial fact. I avoid him. I've avoided anything connected to him since the lawsuit. I specifically took the job at your restaurant because I checked and double-checked that you weren't associated with his operations. But he knows where you work, Orion said, standing now, moving to the windows with controlled energy that reminded Lacey of predators pacing cage boundaries. He knows your son draws buildings and notices details. He knows that if someone wanted to set up surveillance on my restaurant, on my movement patterns, a seemingly innocent child with a sketchbook would be perfect cover. He turned back to her, and Lacey saw in his face that he'd already made some kind of decision, had already calculated outcomes she couldn't begin to predict. Which means Victor might have been planning this operation for months, might have deliberately positioned you and Dean as assets he could activate or eliminate depending on how things played out. The words hit her like physical blows because she'd been so careful, so meticulous about staying invisible, staying uninvolved, and somehow she'd still ended up exactly where she'd spent years trying to avoid, caught between dangerous men who saw people as pieces on boards they were always playing 3 moves ahead. Dean's hand slipped into hers, and she felt him trembling, understanding more than a child should have to understand about the kind of danger they were facing. What do you want from us? Lacey asked, because in her experience men like Orion never explained situations unless they wanted something, never showed their strategic thinking unless they were building toward a proposal that would benefit them more than it cost. Orion's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. I want you to help me destroy Victor Castellano's entire operation. You're a structural architect who knows his work, who's seen his pattern of cutting corners and ignoring safety protocols. I want you to find the weakness in his mill operation, the architectural vulnerability that will let me bring the whole thing down, literally and metaphorically. He moved closer, invading her space deliberately, making sure she understood this was a negotiation where he held every single card. In exchange, I'll clear whatever debt you think you owe him. I'll make sure he never comes near you or Dean again, and I'll give you both protection that actually means something. Lacey looked at her son, at his tear-streaked face and grass-stained knees, and the sketchbook still clutched in his hands with architectural drawings that had inadvertently saved lives. She thought about 8 years of running, of hiding, of taking jobs she was overqualified for, and apartments in neighborhoods where she triple-checked locks and taught Dean to call 911 before calling her. She thought about what kind of life she could give him if she said yes to this devil's bargain, and what kind of life they'd have if she refused and Victor decided they knew too much, or might become useful to Orion anyway. How do I know you won't just use us and then dispose of us when we're no longer valuable? The question was blunt, probably too blunt for someone in her position, but Lacey was tired of pretending, tired of being diplomatic with men who respected strength more than submission. Orion's answer was immediate, delivered with the kind of certainty that came from years of making promises he intended to keep. Because your son saved my life tonight. Because in my world, that creates a debt that doesn't expire, that can't be negotiated away or paid off in cash. Because Dean trusted me enough to run into danger to warn me, and I don't betray people who show me that kind of loyalty. He paused, and something almost like respect entered his expression. And because you're going to be far more valuable to me alive and working than you would be silent and gone. It wasn't reassurance, wasn't comfort, but it was honest in a way that Lacey found herself believing. She looked at Dean one more time, saw him nod slightly, giving her permission to make the choice that would change everything. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll help you, but Dean stays safe. No matter what happens. That's non-negotiable." Orion extended his hand, and when Lacey shook it, she felt the weight of the bargain settle over her like a contract written in something more binding than signatures. "Deal," he said simply. "Welcome to the war, Mrs. Bell." The conference room where Orion laid out his proposition looked like it belonged in a Fortune 500 headquarters, rather than what Lacey suspected was the administrative heart of a criminal empire. All glass walls and ergonomic chairs, and digital displays showing what appeared to be property, surveys and structural assessments that definitely weren't obtained through legal channels. Marcus stood guard outside, while Orion pulled up aerial photographs of Victor's mill complex, the satellite imagery so detailed that Lacey could identify the age of the concrete and the architectural style that dated the original construction to the 1,950 seconds, back when industrial buildings were overbuilt with safety margins that modern cost-cutting had abandoned. Dean sat in a leather chair that was too large for him, his sketchbook open, already annotating the images with observations about foundation angles and load distribution that made Orion glance at him with something that might have been approval if it weren't coming from a man who'd probably ordered violence before breakfast. "Victor's been using this property for 18 months, Orion explained, his voice taking on the cadence of someone briefing military assets rather than discussing criminal operations. "My intelligence suggests he's running product through here, manufacturing, distribution, maybe storage. But every time building inspectors show up, they find nothing. Every time law enforcement gets a warrant, the place is empty except for legitimate maintenance operations. He's got it set up so that everything illegal can be cleared out in under 30 minutes, which means the actual operation is probably hidden in the structure itself." He looked at Lacey with focused intensity. "You testified that he ignores load-bearing requirements and safety protocols. I need you to tell me how he's using that tendency here. I need you to find me the architectural weakness that will let me bring this operation down without it looking like a rival gang hit." Lacey studied the images, her trained eye immediately catching the irregularities that wouldn't be obvious to someone without structural engineering background. The mill had been modified extensively. She could see where new wings had been added without proper foundation expansion, where the original steel frame had been compromised by cuts that should have required compensating reinforcement. "This building should have been condemned," she said slowly, zooming in on a section where the roof pitch didn't match the wall angles. "Look at this section here. They've added at least 40 tons of new machinery or storage without upgrading the support columns. The concrete is probably spalling from moisture damage after 70 years. And if they're running heavy equipment inside, the vibration alone is creating stress fractures in load-bearing elements that were never designed for dynamic loads." She pulled out her own tablet, quickly sketching a cross-section that showed the original 1,950 seconds construction overlaid with the modern modifications. Victor's hiding his operation in the space between the original structure and the renovation work. "See here, these aren't expansion joints. They're access points to interstitial spaces that don't exist on any official blueprint. He's probably running product through the gaps in the walls, using the structural elements themselves as concealment." Her fingers flew across the screen, marking critical points with the kind of precision that came from 15 years of training and 3 years of desperate survival that had taught her to see buildings not as static objects, but as dynamic systems that could be exploited or collapsed depending on where you applied pressure. Orion leaned closer, watching her work with the kind of attention that made Lacey acutely aware of his proximity. The way his cologne mixed with something darker gun oil, she realized, and the metallic scent of someone who lived with violence as a constant companion. "Can you bring it down?" The question was simple, but Lacey heard the complexity beneath it, not just physical demolition, but strategic destruction. Something that would look like tragic structural failure rather than deliberate sabotage. Something that would eliminate Victor's operation while giving Orion plausible deniability. "I can make it look like it was always going to fail," Lacey said carefully, understanding what he was really asking. "If you can get me inside for 6 hours, just 6 hours with the right equipment, I can identify every critical failure point, every place where the structure is one vibration away from catastrophic collapse. Then it's just a matter of choosing the timing." She met his eyes directly, refusing to look away even though this conversation was crossing lines she'd never imagined crossing, was turning her legitimate expertise into something that could kill people if they were inside when the building came down. But you have to promise me that when this happens, the building will be empty. I'll help you destroy Victor's operation, but I won't help you commit mass murder." Something shifted in Orion's expression. Not quite respect, but a recognition that she'd just established a boundary he hadn't expected her to have the leverage to demand. "The operation will be cleared," he said simply. "I want Victor's infrastructure destroyed, not his people. Dead workers create investigations that I don't need, and frankly, most of them are just trying to survive in an economy that doesn't offer them better options." His hand moved across the digital display, pulling up what looked like Victor's movement schedule, a calendar marked with patterns that suggested surveillance so thorough it bordered on prescient. "Victor inspects the mill personally every Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. If the structure fails at 6:30, after he's left but before the day shift arrives, it eliminates his operation without the collateral damage that would bring federal attention." Lacey felt Dean shift beside her, felt her son processing this conversation about destruction and timing, and the casual way these men discussed bringing down buildings as strategic moves in wars that never officially existed. She wanted to shield him from this, wanted to send him out of the room so he wouldn't hear his mother agreeing to use her expertise for purposes that would horrify her former professors and colleagues. But Dean had already saved Orion's life tonight, had already demonstrated the kind of courage that came from seeing problems and solving them regardless of whether solutions were dangerous. And she couldn't protect him from reality by pretending they still had the luxury of normal life. "What happens after?" Lacey asked, needing to understand the full scope of what she was agreeing to. "After Victor's mill is destroyed and his operation is dismantled, what happens to me and Dean? Do we just go back to our apartment and pretend we weren't involved? Hope that Victor doesn't figure out how you managed to target his structural weaknesses so precisely?" The question was sharp, edged with the kind of fear that came from understanding that once you became useful to dangerous men, they rarely let you stop being useful, rarely allowed you to return to the anonymity that had been your only real protection. Orion's answer was immediate, delivered with the finality of someone who'd already made decisions that would reshape her entire world. "You and Dean move into my property tonight. Tomorrow, you're enrolled in my organization as a legitimate architectural consultant, fully documented, fully legal, with contracts and payment structures that will satisfy any scrutiny. I own 3 construction firms and 7 development projects that actually need architectural oversight, which means your employment won't look suspicious, won't trigger questions about why you're suddenly working for me." He pulled up another document, a contract already prepared, already containing details about salary and benefits that made Lacey's breath catch because it was triple what she'd earned even before Victor had blacklisted her from legitimate firms. "You do the work on Victor's mill, and then you do actual architectural work for my actual companies. Your expertise becomes an asset I'm investing in, not a one-time exploitation." The proposal was far more generous than Lacey had expected, which made her immediately suspicious because men like Orion didn't offer charity, didn't provide more than necessary, unless they had strategic reasons that benefited them more than simple kindness. "Why?" she asked bluntly. "Why give us permanent employment and protection instead of just paying me for this one job and making us disappear afterward?" Orion glanced at Dean, at the boy's sketchbook filled with architectural annotations that demonstrated understanding far beyond his years, then back at Lacey, with an expression that suggested he was calculating investments that would pay dividends for decades rather than days. "Because your son has the kind of mind that notices things other people miss. Because he's 8 years old and he already understands structural engineering well enough to spot anomalies in maintenance worker behavior based on how they were accessing vehicle undercarriages. Because in 10 years, Dean is going to be exactly the kind of asset my organization needs. Someone who can see patterns, predict failures, understand systems." His voice softened slightly, became something almost like honest. "And because I remember being a kid in my father's world, learning that the only people you could trust were the ones who had as much to lose as you did. I'm not offering you charity, Mrs. Bell. I'm offering you partnership, with all the obligations and protections that come with being part of my organization." Lacey looked at the contract, at the numbers and clauses and legal language that would transform them from desperate survivors into protected assets. She thought about Dean's face when Orion had called him brave, about the way her son had finally been seen and valued for the intelligence that had made him isolated and strange to other children. She thought about 8 years of being afraid, of checking over her shoulder, of teaching Dean to be invisible when every instinct in his nature wanted to be noticed, to be remarkable, to matter. "If I do this," Lacey said slowly, "if I become part of your organization, I need to know that you understand what you're asking me to become. I'm not a soldier. I'm not comfortable with violence or threats, or the kind of world you operate in. I'm an architect who made one mistake 3 years ago and has been paying for it every day since. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking, betraying the terror beneath her calm exterior. I need to know that you won't expect me to be something I'm not, that my value to you is my expertise with buildings and not anything else. Orion's response was immediate, delivered with the kind of certainty that suggested he'd anticipated this fear. I have plenty of people who are comfortable with violence. I have soldiers and strategists and people who solve problems with weapons and intimidation. What I don't have is someone who can look at a building and see it as a weapon, who understands that sometimes the most effective way to destroy an enemy is to make his infrastructure collapse under its own weight. He stood, extending his hand across the table in a gesture that was both offer and contract. I'm asking you to be exactly what you are, Mrs. Bell, a brilliant architect who's been forced to survive in ways that don't reflect your actual capabilities. I'm giving you the opportunity to use your expertise for purposes that serve my interests, yes, but also purposes that eliminate the threat Victor represents to you and Dean permanently. Lacey stared at his hand, understanding that if she shook it, if she accepted this proposal, she was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed, was choosing Orion's protection and control over the desperate freedom of trying to survive on her own. But Dean's hand slipped into hers, and when she looked at her son, she saw not fear but hope, the kind of fragile, desperate hope that children had when they thought maybe, finally, someone strong enough to keep them safe had arrived. She took Orion's hand, felt his grip firm and certain, felt the weight of the bargain settle over her, like armor that would protect her but also define her. We accept, she said quietly. We'll help you destroy Victor's operation, and then we'll be part of your organization on the terms you've outlined. Orion's smile was sharp and satisfied, the expression of someone who'd just acquired exactly the asset he needed for problems he'd been calculating solutions for. Good, he said simply. Welcome to the family, Mrs. Bell. Marcus will take you and Dean to the residence wing to get settled. Tomorrow morning, we start planning how to bring down Victor's empire one structural failure at a time. As Marcus led them through hallways that grew progressively more residential, more comfortable, Dean whispered to her with the kind of awe that 8-year-olds had when their world suddenly expanded beyond anything they'd imagined possible. Mom, do you think this means we're safe now? Actually safe? Lacey pulled him closer, feeling the weight of choices she'd made tonight. Understanding that safety in Orion Pierce's world came with prices she was only beginning to calculate. I think, she said carefully, honestly, that we're safer than we were this morning, and maybe that's the best we can hope for. But as she watched Dean's face relax for the first time in years, watched tension drain from his small shoulders as he realized they were no longer running, no longer hiding, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she'd made the right choice after all. The residence wing of Orion's property was larger than any apartment Lacey had rented in 8 years of running, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking gardens that were maintained with the kind of precision that spoke of significant resources and obsessive attention to detail. Dean had fallen asleep within minutes of hitting the bed in his assigned room, his sketchbook still clutched in his hands, his small body finally surrendering to exhaustion after a day that had contained more adrenaline and terror than any child should experience. Lacey stood at the window of her own bedroom, a space decorated in warm neutrals with an attached office that Marcus had explained was specifically set up for her architectural work, and tried to process the speed at which her entire world had transformed. 12 hours ago, she'd been a prep cook living in a studio apartment where she could hear her neighbors' arguments through paper-thin walls. Now she was standing in what amounted to a luxury suite, employed by a crime lord, committed to using her expertise to destroy a man who'd spent 3 years making her life a systematic nightmare. Morning came too early, delivered by Marcus knocking on her door with coffee and a tablet containing files that made Lacey's breath catch. Orion had somehow obtained not just Victor's mill blueprints, but the original 1,950 seconds construction documents, every modification permit filed in the past 70 years, structural engineering reports that should have been confidential, and most impressively thermal imaging from what appeared to be drone surveillance, showing heat signatures that revealed exactly how Victor was using the space. Mr. Pierce thought you'd want to start immediately, Marcus said neutrally, as if delivering stolen documents and potentially illegal surveillance data was standard morning procedure. He's requested that you present your initial assessment at noon. Lacey spread the documents across the office desk, her trained eye immediately catching patterns that confirmed her suspicions from the previous night's preliminary analysis. The mill's modifications were a masterclass in exploiting architectural ignorance. Victor had systematically compromised every safety feature of the original construction, while creating spaces that didn't officially exist, gaps between walls where the thermal imaging showed consistent activity that suggested manufacturing or processing operations running 24 hours. But what made Lacey's pulse quicken was the recognition of a pattern she'd seen before. In the parking structure that had partially collapsed 3 years ago, Victor used the same contractor, the same structural engineer who would sign off on modifications without actually ensuring they met code requirements, the same elegant disregard for load-bearing mathematics that made buildings look stable while being fundamentally unsound. She worked through the morning in a state of focused intensity that she hadn't experienced since before Dean was born, when her career had been her identity rather than a liability that made them targets. The mill was even worse than she'd initially assessed. The concrete foundation was showing signs of alkali-silica reaction that would have been visible to any competent inspector. The steel frame had been cut in multiple locations to accommodate new doors and access points without any engineering analysis of load redistribution, and most damning, the roof structure was carrying at least 3 times its original design weight in equipment and materials that Victor had installed without permits. It was a catastrophe waiting to happen, a building that had been kept standing through luck and ignorance rather than structural integrity. "You look like you found something interesting." Orion's voice from the doorway made Lacey jump, made her realize she'd been so absorbed in calculations that she hadn't heard him enter. He moved into the office with the kind of quiet grace that reminded her of dangerous animals, settling into the chair across from her desk as if this were a normal consultation rather than a strategic briefing on how to commit what amounted to architectural homicide. Dean appeared behind him, freshly showered and wearing clothes that Marcus had somehow procured overnight, expensive, well-fitted, the kind of things Lacey could never have afforded on a prep cook's salary. Her son carried his sketchbook and moved to the window seat without being prompted, settling in with the comfortable familiarity of a child who'd already decided this place was safer than anywhere they'd been before. "Your mill is a death trap," Lacey said bluntly, spreading her tablet across the desk so Orion could see the annotated images. "Victor's been systematically destroying the structural integrity for 18 months. Probably without even realizing the full extent of the damage because he doesn't understand that buildings are dynamic systems that respond to stress over time. Look here." She pulled up the thermal imaging overlaid with the original blueprints. "He's added at least 80 tons of manufacturing equipment on the second floor, which was originally designed as light industrial storage with a live load capacity of maybe 40 pounds per square foot. The support columns underneath are showing stress cracks visible in the thermal imaging because the concrete is hot during the day and cold at night, which means water is penetrating the cracks and creating freeze-thaw cycles that exponentially accelerate deterioration." Orion leaned forward, studying the images with the kind of focused attention that suggested he understood more about structural engineering than she'd expected. How long until it fails naturally? The question was clinical, strategic, treating building collapse as an inevitability to be timed, rather than a disaster to be prevented. "Could be tomorrow, could be 6 months, Lacey said honestly. "It depends on loading conditions, weather, vibration from the equipment he's running. But if you want to control the timing, if you want to ensure it fails in a way that looks natural rather than deliberately triggered, you need to understand where the structure is already critically compromised and then add just enough additional stress to push it past the failure threshold." She pulled up a 3-dimensional model she'd constructed, showing the mill's frame with critical areas marked in progressively darker shades of red. These 8 locations are single points of failure. If any one of them gives out, the progressive collapse will take down at least 40% of the building within 90 seconds. If you want complete destruction, you target 3 of them simultaneously. She watched Orion process this information, saw his mind working through implications and timing and strategic advantages. "How would you target them?" he asked quietly. And Lacey understood that they'd moved past theoretical discussion into operational planning, that she was now actively participating in destruction rather than simply identifying vulnerabilities. "You don't need explosives, don't need anything that would leave evidence of deliberate sabotage," Lacey said, pulling up detailed schematics of the critical columns. "These support elements are already carrying loads far beyond their design capacity. All you need is additional weight applied at precise locations, construction materials, equipment, anything that looks legitimate if investigators examine the aftermath. Add 12 tons of concrete blocks here." She pointed to a column on the second floor. "And position a heavy vehicle here on the first floor directly beneath it, and you've created a loading condition that the structure literally cannot sustain. The concrete will crush, the column will fail, and physics takes over from there. Dean's voice cut across the room, startling both of them. "It's like Jenga," he said from the window seat, not looking up from his sketchbook. "You find the blocks that are holding everything up, and you remove them carefully until the tower can't stand anymore. Except Mom's version is reverse Jenga. You add weight instead of removing it. But the concept is the same. Find the critical pieces and make them fail." Lacey felt something cold settle in her chest at her son's casual analysis of building collapse, at the way he'd reduced catastrophic structural failure to a metaphor involving a children's game. This was what she was teaching him. She realized with dawning horror, not how to design buildings that stood for centuries, but how to identify weaknesses that could be exploited for strategic purposes. But before she could say anything, could try to explain that this wasn't normal architectural work, wasn't what she wanted him to learn about their profession, Orion spoke. "Your son is remarkably perceptive, Mrs. Bell." There was something in his voice that wasn't quite approval but wasn't criticism either. Recognition, maybe, of intelligence that transcended age-appropriate boundaries. The Jenga metaphor is accurate. "Your mother has identified 8 critical blocks in Victor's tower, and our job is to make 3 of them fail simultaneously in a way that looks like tragic but inevitable structural deterioration, rather than deliberate sabotage." He turned back to Lacey, and his expression had shifted into something harder, more focused. "I need you to give me a timeline. How long to position the additional loading? How long to stage materials so they don't trigger suspicion? How long between loading and failure?" Lacey pulled up a calendar, started marking dates with the kind of precision that came from years of construction scheduling. "You need a minimum of 2 weeks to position materials without appearing suspicious. Longer would be better. A month would let you bring in equipment and supplies as if you're planning renovation work, which gives you cover if Victor's people are watching for unusual activity. The actual loading of critical points should happen within a 48-hour window to minimize the chance that Victor or his people notice the additional stress on the structure. Then you need 12 to 24 hours for the concrete to settle, for the loading to redistribute through the frame, for microcracks to propagate through elements that are already at their failure threshold." She met Orion's eyes directly. "You're looking at minimum 3 weeks from start to controlled collapse, more like 4 if you want enough margin to guarantee success." She watched Orion calculate, saw him weighing speed against certainty, immediate action against strategic patience. 4 weeks, he said finally. "That gives us enough time to position everything perfectly, to make sure Victor's people don't suspect anything until it's too late to prevent the collapse. It also gives me time to ensure all of Victor's critical operations are relocated to that mill, to make sure that when the building comes down, it eliminates his entire supply chain in one catastrophic failure." His smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Your architectural analysis is about to destroy an empire, Mrs. Bell. I hope you're ready for the magnitude of what you've just made possible." Lacey looked at the model on her screen. At the building she'd reduced to mathematical vulnerabilities and critical failure points. At the work that had transformed from academic exercise into operational weapon. She thought about the parking structure that had collapsed 3 years ago, about the 4 people who'd been injured when Victor's cost-cutting had finally resulted in exactly the kind of disaster she'd warned was inevitable. She thought about 3 years of running, of being afraid, of teaching Dean to be invisible when every instinct in his nature wanted to be remarkable and noticed and valued for his brilliance. "I'm ready," she said quietly, and meant it. "Let's bring down Victor's empire 1 column at a time." Orion stood, but paused at the door, turning back with an expression that might have been respect if it weren't coming from a man who lived by violence and control. "You're not what I expected, Mrs. Bell. I thought I was acquiring a desperate woman with valuable knowledge. What I got was a weapon I didn't know existed, someone who can destroy buildings the same way I destroy organizations, by understanding their weaknesses and applying precise pressure at exactly the right moment." He glanced at Dean, still sketching at the window. "And your son, he's going to be remarkable. My organization will make sure he has every opportunity to develop that brilliance." After Orion left, Lacey walked to where Dean sat and looked at what he'd been drawing while she and Orion planned destruction. Her breath caught. He'd sketched the mill in perfect detail, showing not the way it was but the way it would be in 4 weeks, a pile of rubble and twisted steel, with small figures walking away from the wreckage, carrying boxes and equipment, evacuating before the collapse she and Orion were planning. In the corner, he'd drawn 2 figures holding hands watching the demolition, a woman and a boy, safe and together, and finally free. "Is this what's going to happen, Mom?" Dean asked quietly. "Are we really going to be safe after this?" Lacey pulled him close, holding her remarkable, too smart, too brave son who'd saved a crime lord's life and inadvertently ensured their protection by making them valuable enough to keep. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "After this, we're going to be safe. Mr. Pierce is going to make sure of it." And looking at Orion's retreating figure, at the way he moved through his domain with absolute confidence and controlled violence, Lacey realized she actually believed it. They were under the protection of the most dangerous man in the city, and for the first time in 3 years, that felt less like a threat and more like salvation. The rules arrived at breakfast, delivered by Marcus in a leather portfolio that made them look like corporate policy, rather than the survival instructions they actually were. Lacey sat across from Dean at the massive dining table, a piece of furniture that could seat 20, but currently held just the two of them. Their plates of food prepared by a chef whose salary probably exceeded what she'd earned in an entire year of prep work, and read through Orion's requirements with growing understanding of exactly how controlled her new life was going to be. Dean couldn't leave the property without Marcus or another designated security escort. Lacey's movements would be tracked through her phone, her vehicle, her building access passes. Every person they interacted with would be vetted. Every location they visited would be assessed for tactical vulnerabilities. Every deviation from approved routines would require advance authorization from Orion's security team. It was protection that looked identical to imprisonment, safety that required surrendering every shred of autonomy she'd fought to maintain through 8 years of desperate survival. "These are insane," Lacey said when Orion appeared in the doorway, his presence somehow filling the enormous dining room despite his controlled stillness. "You're basically asking me to accept house arrest in exchange for protection. Dean can't go to school, can't see his friends, can't have anything resembling a normal childhood." She stood, the portfolio still clutched in her hands, anger overriding the fear that probably should have kept her diplomatic with a man who could end her employment and her safety with a single phone call. "I agreed to help you destroy Victor's mill. I didn't agree to become a prisoner in your fortress." Orion crossed the room with deliberate steps, taking the portfolio from her hands and setting it on the table with careful precision. "Victor Castellano has spent 3 years making your life systematically difficult, blacklisting you from legitimate employment, ensuring you stayed desperate and vulnerable. Do you think he did that because he enjoys ruining architects who inconvenience him? Or do you think he did it because keeping you desperate kept you available, kept you from getting stable enough to disappear completely, kept you as a potential asset he could activate if he ever needed someone with structural engineering expertise who owed him favors?" His voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "The bombs under my vehicles weren't random, Mrs. Bell. Victor's been planning that operation for months, which means he's been watching my restaurant for months, which means he knows you work there and he knows your son sketches buildings. Those rules you think are insane? They're the only thing standing between you and Victor deciding that eliminating you both is cleaner than risking you becoming useful to me." The words hit Lacey like ice water, forcing her to reconsider assumptions she'd made about her own insignificance, her own ability to stay invisible by being unimportant. "You think Victor was planning to use us?" she said slowly, understanding crystallizing with horrifying clarity. "You think he kept me poor and desperate specifically so he could force me to help him with something? I think Victor is smart enough to understand that architects who testify against him might be valuable later, especially if they're desperate enough to compromise their principles for the right price." Orion pulled out his phone, showing her surveillance footage that made her stomach drop images of their old apartment building, of Dean's school, of the routes they walked, all time-stamped over the past 6 months. "My people pulled these from Victor's network after we started digging into his operation. He's been watching you, Mrs. Bell. Not constantly, but regularly enough that he knows your patterns, knows your vulnerabilities, knows exactly how to pressure you if he ever decided you were worth the investment." Lacey sat down heavily, feeling the world rearrange itself around implications she'd been too focused on immediate survival to see. Victor hadn't just made her unemployable out of petty revenge, he'd been maintaining her as a strategic asset, keeping her desperate enough to be exploited but visible enough to be accessed when needed. Dean's hand slipped into hers, and she realized her son had been listening to this entire conversation, was processing the revelation that they'd never actually been free, had never actually escaped Victor's attention even when they thought they were successfully invisible. "So these rules," Lacey said quietly, looking at the portfolio that suddenly seemed less like oppression and more like the price of actual safety. "They're not about controlling us. They're about making sure Victor can't get to us before we finish destroying his operation. The rules are about keeping you alive," Orion corrected, his tone matter-of-fact rather than threatening. "After Victor's mill collapses, after his operation is dismantled and his reputation is destroyed, the rules can relax. But until then, You and Dean are targets not because of anything you've done, but because of what you know, what you can do, and who you're now associated with. Victor will assume I've turned you, will assume you're the reason I managed to identify his mill's vulnerabilities. He'll want to eliminate that advantage, which means he'll come after you if he gets the opportunity. Dean spoke up for the first time, his voice small but steady. What about school? I'm supposed to start a new unit on state history next week, and I have a project due on Revolutionary War architecture. The question was so normal, so childlike in its focus on homework rather than existential danger, that Lacey felt her chest tighten with love for her son, who was trying to maintain normalcy in a situation that had nothing to do with normal life. Orion crouched down to Dean's eye level, the same gesture he'd used when they first met, creating a moment of direct connection that bypassed adult intermediaries. What if I told you that you could learn more in the next month working with your mother on actual architectural projects than you would in an entire semester of regular school? What if instead of state history, you studied the history of this property's construction? It was built in 1887. Original Victorian industrial architecture converted to residential use. What if instead of Revolutionary War projects, you helped your mother analyze structural engineering from different historical periods by examining real buildings? He glanced up at Lacey, including her in this negotiation. I have tutors on staff who work with my organization's children, teachers who understand that sometimes education happens outside classrooms. Dean can continue his schoolwork here, supervised and safe, while still learning everything he would in a traditional setting. The offer was more generous than Lacey had expected, more thoughtful than she'd anticipated from a man whose primary expertise was organized violence. She wanted to refuse on principle, wanted to insist that Dean deserved normalcy and friends and playground politics that had nothing to do with criminal empires and architectural sabotage. But looking at her son's face, she saw not disappointment but excitement, the kind of pure joy that came from being offered exactly what his unusual mind needed, rather than being forced to conform to educational structures designed for children who weren't remarkable, who didn't notice things other people missed, who didn't understand load-bearing calculations at 8 years old. Okay, Lacey said finally, surrendering to reality and protection that required accepting control. We'll follow your rules. Dean will work with tutors here. I'll stay on the property except for approved site visits to analyze Victor's mill, and we'll accept that our lives are going to be circumscribed by security protocols until this operation is finished. She met Orion's eyes directly, refusing to look away, even though the intensity of his attention made her want to break contact. But after Victor is eliminated, after his operation is destroyed and we're no longer targets, I need to know that these rules will change, that we'll be part of your organization but not prisoners of it. Orion stood, his expression shifting into something that might have been approval if it weren't so carefully controlled. After Victor is gone, the rules will reflect actual threat levels rather than catastrophic risk. You'll have freedom appropriate to your position in my organization, which means more autonomy than you've had in 3 years, but less than you'd have if you were unconnected to me. His voice softened slightly, became almost gentle. This is the price of safety, Mrs. Bell. Real safety, not the illusion of freedom that comes from being too poor for powerful people to notice you. You're valuable now, which means you're protected, but it also means you're a target for anyone who wants to hurt me or my interests. The rules exist because I've seen what happens to unprotected assets in my world, and I have no intention of letting you or Dean experience that. The honesty in his voice, the acknowledgement that protection came with costs that weren't negotiable, made Lacey realize that Orion wasn't trying to control her for control's sake. He was trying to keep them alive in a world where vulnerability was fatal, where Victor's kind of enemy would absolutely use a child to send messages to rivals, where safety required accepting that freedom and survival sometimes came into direct conflict. She thought about 8 years of running, of being afraid, of teaching Dean to be invisible and quiet and forgettable. She thought about the relief on her son's face when Orion had called him brave, had seen him and valued him instead of treating his intelligence like a problem to be managed. All right, Lacey said quietly. We accept your protection and your rules, but I need you to understand something, Mr. Pierce. She stood, closing the distance between them enough to make her point without making it a challenge. I'm not someone who responds well to being controlled without explanation. If you need me to do something or avoid something, I need to understand why. I need the reasoning, not just the command. Can you work with that? Orion's smile was brief but genuine, transforming his face from dangerous to something almost human. I can work with that, Mrs. Bell. In fact, I prefer it. People who follow orders without understanding them make mistakes when situations change. People who understand the strategic reasoning behind rules make better decisions when they have to adapt. He gestured toward the portfolio. Every rule in that document exists for a specific tactical reason. If you want Marcus to explain the threat assessment behind each one, he will. If you want me to walk you through the security vulnerabilities that informed these protocols, I'll do that. But the rules themselves aren't negotiable. Not until Victor is eliminated and the threat level changes. Lacey nodded, feeling the weight of this new reality settle over her like armor that would protect but also define her. She was no longer invisible, no longer running, no longer trying to survive on her own. She was part of Orion's organization now, which meant she was protected by the most dangerous man in the city, but also bound by rules that would shape every aspect of her daily life. It wasn't freedom in any traditional sense, but looking at Dean, at the way her son had relaxed into this space, had stopped checking over his shoulder, had started sketching buildings again, with the kind of unself-conscious joy she hadn't seen in years. Maybe this version of safety was worth the price. "Thank you," she said quietly, meaning it despite the complexity of what she was thanking him for. For protecting us, for seeing Dean as valuable rather than problematic, for giving us a chance to be something other than desperate. Orion's response was simple, delivered with the kind of certainty that suggested promises he intended to keep. "You're part of my organization now, Mrs. Bell, which means your safety is my responsibility, and I take my responsibilities seriously." He paused at the doorway, looking back with an expression that was difficult to interpret. "And for what it's worth, I don't think you were ever just desperate. I think you were brilliant and unlucky, which is a dangerous combination in a world run by men like Victor. My job is to make sure your brilliance is valued and your luck changes. Everything else follows from there." After he left, Dean looked up from his sketchbook with a question in his eyes. "Mom, are we really safe now? Actually completely safe?" Lacey pulled him close, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and the lingering smell of breakfast and the possibility of futures that didn't involve constant fear. "I think we're safer than we've ever been, baby. And maybe that's all we can ask for." But watching Orion's retreating figure, the way he moved through his domain with absolute confidence and controlled violence, Lacey realized she believed it. They were under his protection, bound by his rules, part of his organization. And for the first time in 3 years, that felt less like a compromise and more like salvation. The assault came 16 days into the mill operation, delivered with the kind of precision that suggested Victor had finally understood exactly what Lacey represented to his immediate survival. 3 vehicles breached Orion's outer perimeter at 2:47 a.m., their approach coordinated to exploit the 3-second gap in camera coverage that shouldn't have existed, that suggested inside information from someone who understood security rotations better than they should. Lacey woke to alarms she'd never heard before, sounds that turned the comfortable residence wing into something that felt like a military installation under siege. Dean was already awake, his room's panic protocols had activated first, steel shutters sliding over windows with mechanical precision, while emergency lighting painted everything in harsh red that made her son look younger than 8, more vulnerable than she could bear to acknowledge. Marcus appeared in her doorway before she'd processed enough to move, his weapon drawn but pointed at the floor. His expression professionally calm despite whatever chaos was erupting outside the reinforced walls. "Stay in your room, lock the door, and don't open it for anyone except me or Mr. Pierce. There's a panic button on the nightstand if anyone breaches this door. You press it and the entire wing goes into lockdown mode that even I can't override." His voice was steady, matter of fact, delivering instructions for surviving home invasion like he was explaining fire drill procedures. "Mr. Pierce is handling the situation. This will be over soon." But Lacey was already moving past him. Ignoring his protests, Dean's hand clutched in hers as she made decisions based on maternal instinct rather than tactical protocol. Where is Orion? She needed to see him, needed to verify he was actually handling this situation rather than lying injured somewhere while his security team tried to contain a breach that had gotten past supposedly impenetrable defenses. Marcus tried to block her path, his body language shifting into something that suggested he would physically restrain her if necessary. But then Orion's voice cut through the commotion, sharp and absolute. "Let her through. If Mrs. Bell wants to see how we handle threats to this property, she's entitled to witness the education." There was something dark in his tone, something that suggested the men who'd breached his perimeter were about to receive lessons that wouldn't be survived. Lacey followed Marcus through hallways that had transformed from residential comfort into tactical corridors, every soft surface suddenly revealing armor plating and defensive positions, every decorative element proving to be disguised security equipment. They emerged into what appeared to be a command center, walls covered in displays showing multiple camera angles of the property's perimeter, where 3 vehicles sat disabled and smoking while figures in tactical gear moved with coordinated precision that looked military rather than criminal. Orion stood at the center of this controlled chaos, his attention fixed on the displays, his voice delivering commands that were being executed in real time by teams she couldn't see but whose effects were immediately visible. North Team, contain and neutralize. I want at least 2 alive for questioning. I need to know how they got our security rotation schedules. South Team, sweep for secondary threats. This feels like a probe rather than a serious assault, which means Victor is testing our response times. His eyes found Lacey and Dean, acknowledged their presence without breaking his operational focus. Mrs. Bell, your presence here is tactically inadvisable but emotionally understandable. Stay behind the reinforced line and watch what happens to people who threaten my assets. Lacey pulled Dean close, shielding his eyes. Even though her son was already watching the displays with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was cataloging tactical decisions and security responses, the same way he analyzed architectural structures. The assault was over in under 4 minutes, Orion's teams moving with efficiency that made it clear this wasn't the first time they'd defended this property, that these protocols had been developed through experience rather than theoretical planning. The surviving attackers were being zip-tied and searched while medical teams treated Orion's people for minor injuries that looked more like abrasions than serious trauma. Not a single shot had been fired inside the property's actual perimeter. The entire confrontation had been contained in the buffer zone between outer and inner security lines, making it clear that breaching Orion's defenses required capabilities Victor's people simply didn't possess. Bring the conscious one to the secure interview room, Orion ordered, his voice still carrying that dangerous edge that made Lacey understand she was seeing a version of him that his business associates probably knew well, but that he'd carefully kept hidden from her during their strategic planning sessions. I want to know everything he knows about who provided our security schedules, and I want to know it in the next 30 minutes. Use whatever methods are necessary to expedite his cooperation. The words were delivered with casual brutality that made Lacey flinch, made her remember that Orion's protection came with violence as its foundation, that the safety she'd accepted for Dean required acknowledging that this man solved problems through methods that had nothing to do with legal systems or moral considerations. But before she could process her discomfort, could try to shield Dean from the reality of what whatever methods are necessary actually meant, Orion turned to face them with an expression that had shifted from operational commander to something almost gentle. That, he said quietly, gesturing toward the displays that now showed his teams efficiently processing the scene, is what happens when someone tries to breach my security to get to people under my protection. Victor sent 6 men to probe my defenses, probably hoping to identify weaknesses he could exploit later, or possibly hoping to get lucky and grab you or Dean before my people could respond. Instead, he lost 6 assets, revealed that he has inside information about my security protocols, and accomplished nothing except demonstrating that attacking this property is suicidal. His dark eyes held Lacey's, made sure she understood the lesson being delivered. You and Dean are safe here not because I ask Victor nicely to leave you alone, but because attempting to harm you requires going through security systems and personnel who are prepared to use lethal force to prevent that outcome. This is what real safety looks like, Mrs. Bell. It's not comfortable, it's not pretty, but it's effective. Dean's voice cut through the tension, small but steady. You knew they were coming, didn't you? That's why you weren't surprised. Why your people were already in position before the vehicles even breached the perimeter. Her son's observation was characteristically acute, noticing details that adults might miss in their focus on the obvious violence. You let them get close enough to think they had a chance, but you were controlling the entire situation from the beginning. Orion's smile was brief but genuine, the expression of someone who appreciated intelligence wherever it appeared. Your son is correct, Mrs. Bell. We've had intelligence suggesting Victor was planning a probe for 3 days. I could have prevented the breach entirely, could have intercepted them miles from this property, but I needed Victor to commit resources to an operation that would fail spectacularly. Needed him to understand that coming after you or Dean isn't just difficult, it's impossible. Now he knows that, even when he has inside information, even when he times his assault perfectly, my defenses are still several levels beyond his capabilities. The tactical reasoning made sense, but Lacey felt anger rising through her fear and relief, felt the weight of being used as bait, even if the trap had been perfectly controlled. You used us, she said, her voice tight with emotion she couldn't fully articulate. You knew Victor would come after us, and you let it happen instead of preventing it. Let Dean wake up to alarms and panic protocols because it served your strategic purposes to demonstrate your security capabilities rather than just keep us completely safe. I kept you completely safe, while also sending Victor a message that will prevent future attempts, Orion corrected, his tone sharpening slightly. If I'd intercepted them miles away, Victor would have learned nothing except that I have good intelligence. He would have tried again, modified his approach, kept probing until he found an actual weakness. This way, he knows that even with inside information and perfect timing, he can't touch you. He knows that my defenses are layered deeply enough that breaching the outer perimeter accomplishes nothing except getting his people captured or killed. He knows that attacking this property to get to you is a losing proposition that will cost him resources without gaining him advantage. Orion moved closer, invading her space deliberately. You're angry because you were frightened. That's understandable. But would you prefer that I prevented this attempt and left Victor believing he still had viable options for getting to you? Or would you prefer that he now understands that you and Dean are untouchable, that targeting you is pointless because my protection is absolute? The logic was sound. The strategic reasoning was clear. But Lacey still felt manipulated, still felt like she and Dean had been pieces on a board rather than people whose emotional trauma mattered. But before she could articulate this, could explain that tactical victories didn't erase the terror of waking to alarms that meant men with weapons were trying to breach their sanctuary, Dean spoke again. I'm glad it happened this way, her son said quietly, looking up at Orion with absolute trust that made Lacey's chest ache. Because now I know we're actually safe instead of just hoping we are. Now I know that even when bad people know where we live and come with weapons and plans, Mr. Pierce's people stop them before they even get close to us. He looked at his mother with eyes that were too old, too understanding for 8 years. Mom, we've been running for 3 years because we didn't have anyone strong enough to stop Victor from hurting us. Now we do. I'd rather be scared for 4 minutes while Mr. Pierce proves that than spend the rest of my life being scared all the time like we were before. The words hit Lacey like a physical blow, made her realize that her son had been carrying fear she'd thought she'd successfully hidden from him, that Dean had understood their vulnerability in ways she'd hoped he was too young to process. She pulled him close, feeling tears threaten for the first time since this nightmare night had started, understanding that Orion's brutal calculation had actually given her son something she couldn't provide. Absolute certainty that they were protected by someone capable of backing up promises with overwhelming force. Victor will try again, Orion said quietly, his voice losing some of its tactical edge. Not here, not directly, but he'll probe for other vulnerabilities, other ways to pressure you or gain leverage. But after tonight, he knows that reaching you physically is off the table, which means his options are limited to psychological pressure or indirect threats, all of which are easier to counter than physical assaults on secured property. He gestured toward Marcus. Take them back to the residence wing. Make sure Dean understands that the panic protocols worked exactly as designed, that he did everything right by staying in his room until authorized personnel arrived. Tomorrow we'll review what happened tonight in detail, answer any questions, and adjust any protocols that caused unnecessary fear. As Marcus led them back through hallways that were already returning to residential normalcy, Lacey realized that Orion was right about one thing. She'd rather be frightened for 4 minutes while watching his capabilities in action than spend years being afraid of threats that might materialize without warning. Victor had made his move, had committed resources and planning to an operation that had failed completely, and now he knew that Lacey and Dean were beyond his reach. It wasn't comfort, wasn't peace, but it was security backed by demonstrated capacity for violence that made safety something real, rather than hoped for. Mom? Dean's voice was quiet as they reached their rooms. Are we still going to help Mr. Pierce destroy Victor's mill? Because after tonight, I really want to make sure Victor can never try to hurt us again. Lacey looked at her son, at the determination in his face that came from understanding that safety required eliminating threats rather than just hiding from them. Yes, baby, she said firmly. We're going to help Mr. Pierce bring down Victor's entire operation, and when we're done, Victor won't have the resources or capability to threaten anyone ever again. And standing in the reinforced corridor with alarms still echoing in her memory and Dean's hand clutched in hers, Lacey meant it. Victor had made himself her enemy 3 years ago. Now she had the power to make sure he paid for every day of fear he'd inflicted. And she was going to use it. The domestic moment arrived unexpectedly 3 days after the assault, delivered in the form of Dean, sprawled across the living room floor with architectural drawings scattered around him like puzzle pieces he was trying to force into patterns that didn't exist in reality. Lacey had been reviewing updated thermal imaging of Victor's mill when Dean's frustrated sigh, the kind of sound that meant her brilliant son had encountered a problem his intelligence couldn't immediately solve, pulled her attention away from structural calculations. He was attempting to redesign Orion's property's garden layout to incorporate what appeared to be a medieval trebuchet, his sketch showing detailed mechanical drawings that were simultaneously impressive in their technical accuracy and absurd in their application to residential landscaping. A trebuchet, Lacey said, settling onto the floor beside him with amusement that felt strange after days of tactical planning and security reviews. You want to put a siege weapon in Mr. Pierce's garden. Is there a particular reason we're fortifying the property against castle assaults? Or is this purely theoretical engineering? She picked up one of his drawings, studying the counterweight calculations that were actually correct for a scale model, marveling at how her son's mind worked through physics problems that most adults couldn't begin to conceptualize. Dean's grin was pure mischief, the kind of expression she hadn't seen in months of stress and fear and running. Mrs. Chen, the tutor, Mr. Pierce hired, said we should design something that incorporates historical military engineering and modern structural analysis. I thought a trebuchet would be perfect because it's basically just applied physics and load-bearing calculations. Plus, it would be really cool to actually build one and test if the mathematics work in real life instead of just on paper. His enthusiasm was infectious, made Lacey remember why she'd fallen in love with architecture in the first place. The joy of seeing physical structures as mathematical puzzles that could be solved through careful analysis and creative application of engineering principles. Your counterweight is going to need additional support, Lacey pointed out, sketching modifications to his design that would distribute stress more evenly across the trebuchet's frame. See here, if you're using this length of throwing arm with this weight ratio, the pivot point is going to experience rotational forces that will tear through wood unless you reinforce it with steel brackets. And your base calculations assume the ground is level. But the garden has about a 3-degree slope in this direction, which means your projectile trajectory is going to be off by several feet, unless you compensate for the angle. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, mother and son collaborating on a project that had nothing to do with criminal empires or building demolitions or men who solved problems with violence. It was normal, achingly normal, the kind of afternoon they used to have before Victor had destroyed her career and forced them into years of desperate survival. Dean was explaining his theory about how different projectile weights would affect range when Lacey heard footsteps and looked up to find Orion standing in the doorway, watching them with an expression that was difficult to interpret, something between curiosity and something darker, more complicated. I see we're expanding our architectural expertise into medieval military engineering, Orion said, moving into the room with that controlled grace that made even casual movement look deliberate. Should I be concerned that my property is being redesigned to withstand siege warfare, or is this purely academic interest? His tone was light, almost teasing, a version of himself Lacey hadn't encountered before. Less commander, more human, as if watching them work together had unlocked some capacity for normalcy he usually kept carefully controlled. Dean immediately launched into an explanation of trebuchet mechanics that was probably more detailed than Orion needed, his hands gesturing as he described counterweight ratios and projectile trajectories with the kind of passion that made Lacey's chest ache with love for her brilliant, unusual child. Orion listened with genuine attention, asking questions that suggested he actually understood the engineering principles rather than just pretending interest to be polite. When Dean finally ran out of words, Orion crouched down to examine the drawings with focused intensity that made Lacey realize he was seeing what she saw. Not just a child's project, but evidence of a mind that could analyze complex systems and design solutions that actually worked. You know, Orion said slowly, I have a warehouse full of construction materials and equipment that my development companies use for various projects. If you wanted to actually build this properly reinforced, correctly calibrated, safe enough to operate without catastrophic failure, I could provide the resources and workspace. Consider it an educational investment in understanding how theoretical engineering translates to physical construction. He glanced at Lacey, including her in this offer. Your mother would have to approve the project and supervise the construction to ensure it meets safety standards, but I think building a functional siege weapon would teach you more about structural engineering than any number of textbook problems. Dean's face lit up with joy so pure, so unguarded, that Lacey felt tears threaten for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. This was what her son had been missing. Not just safety, but the opportunity to be remarkable, to have his intelligence valued, rather than treated as problematic, to work on projects that challenged his capabilities, rather than dumbed down to age-appropriate limitations. Can we, Mom, please? I promise I'll follow all safety protocols and I'll document every step of the construction process for my portfolio, and I'll make sure the calculations are perfect before we start building anything. Lacey looked at Orion, trying to understand why he would invest time and resources into a child's engineering project, trying to read the motivations behind generosity that felt genuine but came from a man whose world operated on strategic calculations rather than simple kindness. Why? She asked quietly, needing to understand before she agreed to anything. Why does my son's siege weapon matter to you? Why are you offering resources and support for something that has nothing to do with destroying Victor's operation or protecting your interests? Orion settled onto the floor across from them, his expensive suit somehow not looking ridiculous in this domestic setting, his presence transforming from intimidating to almost comfortable. Because I remember being Dean's age in my father's world, learning that intelligence was only valuable if it could be weaponized, that creativity was a liability unless it served strategic purposes. I remember wanting to build things, to understand how structures worked, to be remarkable at something other than violence and control. His voice carried weight that suggested memories he rarely accessed, experiences that had shaped him in ways he usually kept hidden. Your son is brilliant, Mrs. Bell. Not just smart, but genuinely exceptional, in ways that will make him either remarkable or miserable, depending on whether he's given opportunities to develop his capabilities. I'm offering those opportunities because I can, because resources I have in abundance cost me nothing to share, and because, he paused, choosing words carefully, because I haven't felt peace in years. Not the kind of peace that comes from watching people be genuinely happy doing things that matter to them. And watching you two work together on this absurd siege weapon project made me feel something I'd forgotten existed. The confession was unexpected, delivered with honesty that made Lacey see Orion as something other than a dangerous man who'd coerced her into working for him. He was lonely. She realized with sudden clarity, not alone, because he was surrounded by security teams and business associates and people who executed his commands, but fundamentally isolated in ways that came from living in a world where trust was tactical rather than emotional, where relationships were strategic rather than genuine. Watching her and Dean collaborate with unself-conscious joy had given him access to something he'd lost or never had the simple pleasure of witnessing people be authentically themselves without calculation or performance. Okay, Lacey said softly, making a decision that had nothing to do with strategic advantage and everything to do with understanding that sometimes generosity was just generosity, that sometimes powerful people did kind things not because it served their interests, but because witnessing joy was its own reward. We'll build the trebuchet. Dean will learn how theoretical engineering becomes physical reality. I'll supervise construction to ensure nobody gets killed by medieval siege weapons. And you, she looked at Orion directly, seeing him fully for the first time, you get to watch us be happy doing something that has nothing to do with your war with Victor. Deal? Orion's smile was genuine, transforming his face from dangerous to something almost vulnerable. Deal, Mrs. Bell. I'll have Marcus arrange access to the warehouse and provide whatever materials and equipment you need. Consider it payment for the education I'm receiving watching you work. He stood, preparing to leave, but paused at the doorway with an expression that suggested words he was testing before speaking. Thank you for letting me be part of this. It's been years since I've been around people who are just happy, without agenda, without calculation, without constantly assessing threats and advantages. He seemed to struggle for language. It's something I didn't know I needed until I saw it. After he left, Dean looked at his mother with questions in his eyes. Mom, is Mr. Pierce lonely? Like actually lonely, not just alone? The observation was characteristically perceptive, her 8-year-old son seeing emotional truths that adults often missed in their focus on surface presentations. Lacey pulled Dean close, thinking about the man who'd saved their lives by taking them into his dangerous world, who protected them with violence but watched them with something that looked like longing for normalcy he couldn't access himself. I think Mr. Pierce is very lonely, baby. I think he's surrounded by people but doesn't have anyone who sees him as something other than dangerous or useful. And I think watching us be a family reminds him of things he doesn't have and maybe wishes he did. Should we invite him to help build the trebuchet? Dean asked, with the kind of simple generosity that children possessed before the world taught them that kindness was complicated. I mean, it's his warehouse and his materials, and maybe if he helps build something instead of just watching, he'd feel less lonely. Lacey thought about Orion's confession, about peace he hadn't felt in years, about the weight of living in a world where relationships were strategic rather than genuine. She thought about the way he'd looked at her and Dean working together, the longing in his expression that suggested hunger for connection he couldn't articulate or pursue through normal channels. Yes, baby, she said firmly. We'll invite Mr. Pierce to help build the trebuchet. Because everyone deserves to be part of something joyful, even dangerous men who protect people by being more dangerous than their enemies. And that evening, when she found Orion in his study reviewing security reports, she made the invitation that would change everything. Dean and I would like you to help us build the trebuchet, not as a sponsor or resource provider, but as an actual participant in the construction process. We thought maybe you'd enjoy learning medieval engineering while teaching Dean about project management and structural problem solving. Orion looked up from his reports, surprise and something deeper crossing his face, hope, maybe, or the tentative beginning of allowing himself to want things that weren't strategic advantages or tactical victories. I'd like that, he said simply. I'd like that very much. And watching his careful smile, Lacey realized they'd just offered him something more valuable than destroying Victor's operation. They'd offered him family, messy and complicated and real, with no agenda except the simple desire to include him in joy that had nothing to do with his capacity for violence. It was a gift he clearly hadn't expected, hadn't known he wanted, hadn't believed was possible in his carefully controlled world. But it was also a gift that would bind them together in ways that transcended employment contracts and strategic alliances, creating connections that couldn't be reduced to tactical advantages or protective arrangements. They were becoming something real, something that looked less like a business relationship and more like the foundations of family built on choice rather than biology, on shared projects rather than shared bloodlines. And standing in Orion's study, watching him process this invitation with careful vulnerability, Lacey understood that they were all being transformed by this strange arrangement, not just protected but healed, not just surviving but learning what it meant to build something together that wasn't about destruction or fear or strategic advantage. They were building a family, one siege weapon at a time. The completed analysis of Victor's mill arrived at Orion's desk 26 days after Lacey had started work, delivered in a presentation that transformed architectural assessment into operational weaponry. She'd arranged the conference room with the kind of precision she used to employ for client meetings back when her career was legitimate, when she presented to developers who wanted buildings that maximized profit while minimizing construction costs. But this presentation wasn't about profit margins or construction timelines. It was about identifying the exact sequence of structural failures that would eliminate Victor's empire while looking like tragic but inevitable architectural deterioration. Orion sat across from her with Marcus and 2 other senior members of his organization, all of them studying the 3-dimensional model on the display with focused intensity that suggested they understood exactly what they were looking at. A building reduced to mathematical vulnerabilities, transformed from physical structure into tactical weapon. Victor's mill is currently supporting approximately 400 tons of equipment and materials across 3 floors that were never designed for this loading, Lacey began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was presenting. The original 1,950 seconds construction assumed light industrial use with maximum floor loads of 50 pounds per square foot. Victor's modifications have increased actual loading to over 300 pounds per square foot in critical areas, creating stress conditions that exceed design capacity by factors of 6 in some locations. She pulled up detailed images showing crack propagation in support columns, spalling concrete revealing corroded reinforcement, and connections that were visibly distorting under loads they were never engineered to carry. The building should have failed naturally months ago. The only reason it's still standing is that the failures are propagating slowly enough that Victor hasn't noticed the progressive deterioration. She walked them through the 8 critical failure points she'd identified, explaining in technical detail that she translated into operational language for people whose expertise was violence rather than engineering. Column A7 on the 2nd floor was experiencing concrete crushing at the top, creating a condition where adding 12 tons of additional load would cause immediate catastrophic failure. Beam B3 had lost 60% of its effective cross-section to corrosion, making it incapable of carrying current loads if subjected to any dynamic loading like vibration or impact. Foundation element F12 showed settlement differential that indicated soil consolidation underneath, meaning the column it supported was already carrying loads at dangerous angles that would cause buckling with minimal additional stress. Each failure point was a precision target, a place where adding calculated weight or removing marginal support would trigger collapse that investigators would attribute to decades of deferred maintenance and Victor's systematic ignorance of safety requirements. The sequence matters, Lacey emphasized, pulling up a simulation that showed the mill's progressive collapse frame by frame. If we target these 3 elements simultaneously, A7, B3, and F12, the failure propagates through the structure in a cascade that brings down 70% of the building within 90 seconds. The remaining 30% become structurally unsound and will be condemned immediately, requiring complete demolition that will destroy any evidence of Victor's operations that survived the initial collapse. She met Orion's eyes directly. But the targeting has to be precise. We're talking about positioning specific loads to within inches of calculated locations, timing the loading to create simultaneous stress conditions, and ensuring that the collapse happens when the building is empty, so we're not creating mass casualties that would trigger federal investigations. Orion leaned forward, studying the simulation with the kind of focused attention she'd come to recognize as his analytical mode, the mental state where he processed information and calculated implications faster than she could articulate them. Timeline from final loading to collapse? 18 to 36 hours, Lacey said confidently. The additional stress will cause immediate microcracking in the concrete, which propagates over time as the load redistributes through compromised elements. We position the loads on a Wednesday evening after Victor's inspection, but before the weekend shift arrives, and the building fails sometime Thursday morning or early afternoon. Timing is variable because we're triggering natural failure, rather than using explosives, but the window is predictable enough that we can clear the area and ensure no casualties. Evidence trail? This question came from Marcus, always focused on operational security, on ensuring that actions couldn't be traced back to Orion's organization even if investigators looked closely. Lacey pulled up documentation that showed Victor's own inspection reports, code violation notices that had been ignored, structural engineering assessments that had warned about deterioration that Victor had dismissed as overly cautious. The building is a documented hazard that should have been condemned 2 years ago. Victor's own records show he was warned repeatedly about structural deficiencies and chose to ignore them because addressing the problems would have required shutting down operations and spending money on repairs that weren't visible to customers. When the mill collapses, investigators will find exactly what they expect. A building that failed because the owner prioritized profit over safety, ignored expert warnings, and continued to load the structure beyond its capacity. She met Orion's eyes. My architectural analysis doesn't appear anywhere in this evidence trail. The only connection to me is that I work for your organization, and since you have legitimate construction companies that employ structural engineers, my presence on your staff doesn't raise questions. The presentation continued for another 40 minutes. Lacey walking them through contingencies and failure modes, answering technical questions with precision that made Orion's people understand she'd thought through every variable, anticipated every potential complication. When she finished, silence filled the conference room, not uncomfortable but weighted, the kind of quiet that came from people processing the magnitude of what they'd just been shown. Lacey had transformed a building into a weapon, had reduced Victor's empire to mathematical vulnerabilities that could be exploited with calculated precision, had created a plan that would eliminate their enemy, while leaving no evidence of deliberate sabotage. Mrs. Bell, Orion said quietly, his voice carrying respect that hadn't been present in their earlier interactions. You've just presented the most elegant destruction plan I've seen in 15 years of operational planning. This isn't just structural engineering, this is architectural assassination, using Victor's own negligence as the weapon that destroys him. He stood, moving to the display where her simulation showed the mill's collapse frame by frame. When can we begin final positioning? The materials are already staged at the warehouse location we've been using as a front, Lacey said, referring to one of Orion's legitimate construction sites that had provided cover for moving equipment and supplies without triggering Victor's surveillance. We need 3 days to transport everything to the mill under the pretense of Victor's own renovation work. I created false work orders and contractor documentation that his people will recognize as legitimate because they match his usual pattern of cutting corners and using uncertified labor. She pulled up the execution timeline, days marked with specific tasks and contingencies. Final positioning happens Tuesday night through Wednesday morning, well after Victor's weekly inspection, but early enough that his people assume it's preparation for work that's scheduled to begin Thursday. The building fails Wednesday evening or Thursday morning, eliminating his operation and all evidence of his activities in one catastrophic collapse that investigators will attribute to his criminal negligence. Orion studied the timeline with Marcus and his senior people, their low conversation too quiet for Lacey to hear, but their body language suggesting approval, acceptance of her plan as operationally sound. When they finished conferring, Orion turned back to her with an expression that had shifted from professional respect to something more personal, more complicated. After this operation concludes, after Victor's empire is eliminated, and you're no longer in immediate danger, what do you want, Mrs. Bell? The question was unexpected, delivered with genuine curiosity rather than strategic calculation. You've proven yourself invaluable to my organization, not just for this operation, but as someone who sees systems and finds vulnerabilities that people trained in violence would never notice. I could keep you employed indefinitely, could give you projects that use your expertise in ways that benefit my legitimate businesses, while occasionally serving strategic purposes. But what do you actually want your life to look like once you're not running from Victor? Lacey hadn't allowed herself to think about futures that extended beyond destroying the threat that had defined 3 years of desperate survival. She looked at the conference room, at the displays showing her plan to eliminate an enemy through applied mathematics and structural engineering, at Orion watching her with focused attention that suggested her answer mattered more than strategic considerations. She thought about Dean in the warehouse workshop building a siege weapon with Marcus supervising, her son laughing while learning to weld reinforcement brackets under the protective watch of a former Special Forces operative who'd learned to value an 8-year-old's questions. She thought about afternoons working on architectural projects that challenged her capabilities, about security that let her sleep without triple-checking locks, about being seen and valued for her expertise rather than being invisible and desperate. I want what we've been building here, Lacey said quietly, honestly. I want Dean to grow up safe and challenged and valued for being remarkable instead of punished for being different. I want to do work that matters, that uses my training in ways that feel meaningful even if they serve your interests rather than pure architectural aesthetics. I want... She paused, understanding she was about to cross a line that would change everything. I want to be part of something real instead of just surviving at the margins. I want this family we've been accidentally creating while planning Victor's destruction. The words hung between them, transforming their relationship from employer-employee or protector-protected into something that didn't have easy categories, something that looked like partnership built on mutual respect and shared purposes. Orion moved closer, closing the distance until they were near enough that Lacey could see the complexity in his dark eyes, the way he was processing her confession against his own carefully controlled emotional landscape. I want that too, Orion said simply, his voice carrying the weight of admission that cost him something. I want you and Dean to be permanent parts of my life, not just protected assets, but actual family that matters beyond strategic value. I want to watch Dean build impossible engineering projects and hear him explain trebuchet mechanics with complete seriousness. I want to work with you on architectural problems and watch you transform buildings into weapons when necessary and beautiful structures when possible. I want... He reached out, his hand finding hers with careful deliberation. I want this partnership to be real, Lacey. Not contracted or coerced, or based on mutual convenience. Real, in all the complicated, messy ways that make family something you choose rather than something you're born into. The use of her first name, the admission of wanting things that weren't tactical advantages, the vulnerability in his expression, all of it combined to make Lacey understand that they'd reached a threshold where strategic relationships became actual connection, where protection transformed into care that transcended operational parameters. She stepped closer, letting her free hand rest against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and certain beneath expensive fabric and controlled danger. After Victor's mill collapses, Lacey said, after his empire is eliminated and we're safe, let's build something permanent. Not just employment and protection, but actual family with all the complications and commitments that come with choosing each other deliberately. She smiled, feeling something like hope for the first time in 3 years. Let's be remarkable together, Orion. Let's create something that has nothing to do with violence or fear and everything to do with partnership and choice. Orion's kiss was careful and deliberate, a claiming that felt like promise rather than possession, connection that acknowledged everything they'd survived and everything they were choosing to build together. When they finally broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, his breath warm and steady. After Victor falls, Orion said quietly, we become permanent. You, me, and Dean. A family built on choice and respect, and the kind of partnership that makes us stronger together than we could ever be separate. He pulled back slightly, his smile sharp with anticipation. But first we bring down an empire one column at a time, and then we build ours. And standing in that conference room with architectural diagrams of destruction surrounding them, Lacey understood that they'd transformed from desperate allies into something infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more valuable partners who saw each other completely, who valued each other beyond strategic usefulness, who were choosing to build family from the ruins of enemies they'd destroyed together. It was the beginning of everything. The mill collapsed at 11:43 a.m. on Thursday, Exactly 31 hours after Lacey's carefully calculated loads had been positioned at critical failure points with precision that would have impressed structural engineers if they'd understood they were witnessing deliberate sabotage rather than tragic architectural failure. Orion watched the event unfold through multiple camera angles. His surveillance teams had positioned throughout the neighborhood, feeds showing the building from every direction, as decades of compromised structure finally surrendered to loads it could no longer sustain. The collapse began with column A7 on the second floor, Lacey's primary target, the element she'd identified as most critically overstressed crushing suddenly with a sound like artillery that echoed through abandoned industrial zones, where Victor had believed his isolation provided security rather than vulnerability. The failure propagated exactly as her simulation had predicted. Steel connections tearing free from concrete that had lost its tensile capacity, beams sagging and then snapping as their effective cross-sections proved insufficient for loads they were carrying. Dean stood beside Orion in the command center, his sketchbook open, documenting the collapse frame by frame with the kind of focused attention he'd apply to any engineering problem that challenged his understanding of structural behavior. "Mom was right about the propagation sequence," he said quietly, his voice carrying awe rather than fear despite witnessing destruction that would eliminate millions of dollars in criminal infrastructure. "See how the second floor collapsed first? And then the weight of that falling debris overloaded the first floor supports. And then the whole thing came down in a progressive cascade? That's exactly what her model predicted. You can't stop it once the critical element fails, because the system doesn't have redundancy to redistribute the loads." Lacey appeared in the doorway, having watched the collapse from her office where her own feeds showed detailed views of specific structural elements failing in sequence she'd spent weeks calculating. She looked exhausted and satisfied, and something darker complicit in destruction that served justice, but still involved eliminating a building through deliberate exploitation of weaknesses she'd identified. Orion understood that expression, recognized the weight of using expertise for purposes that transcended professional ethics, the complicated feeling of being right about predictions that resulted in spectacular destruction. "The building is down," Lacey said unnecessarily, stating the obvious because sometimes monumental events required acknowledgement even when everyone present could see the evidence on multiple displays. "Emergency services are responding, but there won't be casualties because Victor's people evacuated yesterday after we triggered the anonymous tip about gas leaks. Investigators are going to find exactly what we planted. Evidence of systematic code violations, ignored safety warnings, structural deterioration that Victor dismissed, because addressing it would have cost him operational capacity. They're going to rule this a catastrophic failure caused by criminal negligence, and Victor is going to face civil and criminal liability that will bankrupt him even if the criminal charges somehow don't result in conviction." Marcus entered with updates from field teams, his report delivered with military precision. "Victor's off-site warehouses are being raided by federal agencies as we speak. Someone provided them with detailed information about his distribution network and financial records that connect him to the mill operations. His legitimate business fronts are being investigated for money laundering. His political connections are distancing themselves to avoid contamination, and his organization is fracturing as lieutenants realize he no longer has the resources or protection to maintain control." He glanced at Orion with satisfaction. The mill collapse isn't just destroying his operations, it's the visible symbol of catastrophic failure that triggers the cascade, eliminating his entire empire. Orion felt something dark and satisfied settle in his chest. The particular pleasure that came from executing operations so precisely that enemies didn't just lose, they were systematically dismantled, their infrastructure destroyed, their networks collapsed, their futures eliminated through combinations of violence and strategy that left no room for recovery. Victor Castellano had made the mistake of threatening people under Orion's protection, had allowed his negligence to create weapons that could be turned against him, had fundamentally underestimated the woman he'd spent 3 years keeping desperate and vulnerable. Now he was paying the price in ways that would echo through organized crime networks, as cautionary tales about what happened when you created enemies with expertise you didn't understand and couldn't control. "What happens to Victor now?" Dean asked with the directness children possessed before they learned that some questions weren't asked in polite company. "Does he go to jail? Does he disappear? Does someone from his organization try to kill him because he lost all their money and operations?" The questions were delivered without judgment. Simple curiosity about consequences that would follow catastrophic failure in a world where weakness was punished without mercy. Orion crouched to Dean's eye level. The gesture he'd learned made difficult conversations feel less intimidating for a child who'd seen and understood more than most adults. Victor's going to face legal consequences that will eliminate his freedom for decades. The criminal negligence that caused this collapse is prosecutable, and he doesn't have the resources or connections to avoid conviction. When federal prosecutors decide to make examples of people who create disasters through deliberate disregard for safety. But before that happens, he's also going to face consequences from his own organization. People who've lost millions of dollars in operational capacity because of his failures. People who won't accept that kind of catastrophic loss without demanding accountability that has nothing to do with legal systems. He paused, making sure Dean understood the full picture without glorifying violence. In my world, failure. This spectacular doesn't just end careers, it ends lives. Victor created the conditions for his own destruction through negligence and arrogance. Now he's experiencing consequences he thought he was powerful enough to avoid. Lacey moved to stand beside them, her hand finding Dean's shoulder with maternal protectiveness that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with her son learning these lessons about how justice operated outside legal frameworks. But what matters for us? She said firmly, redirecting the conversation toward what Dean needed to hear, rather than operational details about Victor's impending elimination, is that Victor can't hurt us anymore. He doesn't have resources to threaten us, doesn't have infrastructure to support operations against people under Mr. Pierce's protection, doesn't have any future except consequences that will occupy him completely. We're safe, Dean. Actually, permanently safe in ways we haven't been since before you were born. The relief on Dean's face made Orion's chest ache with something he'd learned to recognize as care that transcended strategic value. Emotional investment in people who'd become family rather than assets. He'd started this operation planning to use Lacey's expertise to eliminate an enemy who'd become problematic. He'd ended it with a child asking him questions about justice, and a woman looking at him like he'd given her something more valuable than safety. He'd given her the power to destroy the man who'd spent years making her life systematically unbearable, had transformed her from victim into victor, through providing resources and protection that let her expertise become weapon instead of liability. It's over, Orion said simply, standing and looking at the displays still showing emergency services processing the mill's collapse. Investigators already beginning work that would occupy them for months, while they documented Victor's criminal negligence. Victor's empire is eliminated, his operations are dismantled, his future is reduced to consequences rather than opportunities. You're both safe now, not just protected by my security, but safe because the threat that made you targets no longer exists. He turned to Lacey, finding her watching him with expression that combined gratitude and something deeper, something that looked like the beginnings of love built on shared purposes and mutual respect. Your debt is paid, Lacey. Victor's gone, your life is yours again, and Dean can grow up without fear that yesterday's enemies will become tomorrow's threats. Lacey crossed the room to him, her movement deliberate, her eyes never leaving his face. My debt isn't paid, she said quietly, her voice carrying emotion that made Marcus discreetly exit with Dean in tow, giving them privacy for whatever conversation was happening in looks and proximity rather than just words. My debt is transformed from something I owed Victor into something I owe you. You saved us, Orion. Not just from Victor, but from 3 years of being afraid, of running, of teaching my son to be invisible when everything in his nature wants to be remarkable. You gave us safety and opportunity and family we didn't know existed. That's not a debt that gets paid and forgotten, that's a debt that gets transformed into something permanent. Orion pulled her close, feeling the rightness of her body against his, the way partnership had evolved into something that looked like love built on shared survival and mutual transformation. I don't want debt, he said firmly. I want partnership. I want you and Dean permanently in my life. Not because you owe me, but because we've built something together that's worth more than any strategic advantage. I want family, Lacey. The kind you choose deliberately because living without it would make everything else meaningless. Lacey's kiss was answer and promise, claiming that felt mutual rather than one-sided, connection that acknowledged everything they'd survived together and everything they were choosing to build. When they finally broke apart, her smile was genuine and free, the expression of someone who'd stopped running, stopped being afraid, stopped accepting that survival meant invisibility. Let's make it permanent, Lacey said. Let's build our family officially, with commitments and vows and partnership that has nothing to do with contracts or coercion. Let's choose each other deliberately, Orion. Let's be remarkable together. And watching emergency services crawl over the ruins of Victor's empire, seeing Dean through the doorway, sketching the collapse with Marcus, explaining structural failure patterns, understanding that they'd eliminated threats and created safety through partnership that had transformed everyone involved, Orion felt something he'd thought was impossible in his world. He felt peace and hope and the beginning of family built on choice rather than blood, on shared purposes rather than strategic advantages, on love that came from seeing each other completely and choosing partnership anyway. It was everything, and it was just the beginning. The wedding happened 6 weeks after Victor's mill collapsed, held in the garden where Dean's trebuchet stood as monument to family built through shared projects rather than traditional paths. Lacey wore burgundy silk that matched the color she'd been wearing the night Dean had saved Orion's life, symbolic reminder that their family had begun with courage and desperation, and a child's absolute refusal to let people die when he could prevent it. Orion stood beneath an arch Marcus had constructed with the same precision he applied to security operations, wearing charcoal gray that made his dark eyes appear even more intense. His expression carefully controlled, except when he looked at Dean standing beside him as best man, the 8-year-old taking his responsibilities with complete seriousness that made everyone present smile. The ceremony was small. Marcus and key members of Orion's organization, who'd become something like extended family through months of collaborative work. A few of Lacey's former colleagues who'd quietly reached out after Victor's arrest, suggesting they'd always believed her testimony about structural deficiencies. The tutors and staff who'd helped Dean adjust to life in Orion's household. No traditional wedding party, no elaborate production, just people who mattered witnessing vows that meant something because they represented choices made deliberately rather than expectations met conventionally. "I'm not good at this," Orion began, his prepared vows apparently abandoned in favor of honest words delivered without performance or calculation. "I'm not good at being vulnerable, at admitting I need people, at building relationships that don't serve strategic purposes. I've spent most of my life learning to be dangerous, to protect what's mine through control and violence, to see people as assets or threats rather than partners who make me better than I could be alone." He looked at Lacey with expression that held vulnerability he rarely showed, that suggested he was working through emotions in real time rather than presenting prepackaged sentiments. "But you and Dean, you taught me that being dangerous isn't enough, that control without connection is just isolation with better security, that the most valuable things in life are the ones you can't protect through violence, because they require being open enough to be hurt." His hands found hers, grip firm and certain. "I love you, Lacey. I love Dean. I love this family we've built from disaster and necessity and shared purposes that transformed into something real. And I promise to spend the rest of my life proving that you chose correctly when you trusted me with your safety and your son and your heart." Lacey felt tears threatening, felt the weight of vows that meant everything because they came from a man who didn't make promises lightly, whose word was contract more binding than legal documents. "You saved us," she said simply, delivering her own vows with honesty that transcended traditional wedding script, not just from Victor but from 3 years of being afraid, of surviving rather than living, of teaching Dean to hide his brilliance instead of celebrating it. "You gave us safety and opportunity and family that doesn't require hiding who we are or apologizing for being remarkable. You saw me when I'd spent years trying to be invisible, valued my expertise when everyone else saw only liability, gave Dean permission to be extraordinary instead of forcing him to be normal." She squeezed his hands, feeling the rightness of this moment, this choice, this partnership they'd built through shared destruction and collaborative creation. "I love you, Orion. I love the way you protect without controlling, the way you value intelligence wherever you find it, the way you're learning to build joy instead of just eliminating threats. And I promise to spend the rest of my life being your partner in everything, in raising Dean, in building your legitimate businesses, in creating family that's worth more than empires built on violence and control." Dean stepped forward with rings Marcus had helped him select, simple platinum bands engraved with coordinates that marked the spot where the mill had stood before they'd brought it down together. Symbolic reminder that their family had been forged through destroying enemies and creating safety, through partnership. Orion slid the ring onto Lacey's finger with careful reverence, his touch gentle despite hands that had ordered violence and executed strategies that eliminated rivals without mercy. Lacey returned the gesture, watching her ring settle onto Orion's hand and transform him from solitary, dangerous man into husband who'd chosen partnership over isolation. The officiant, a judge who owed Orion favors and asked no questions about unconventional families, built through circumstances that transcended legal categories, pronounced them married with efficiency that suggested he understood this. Ceremony mattered more for what it represented than for legal paperwork that formalized relationships. Orion kissed Lacey with careful intensity that made Dean cover his eyes with dramatic 8-year-old disgust, made the assembled guests applaud, made Marcus smile with satisfaction that his employer had finally found something worth protecting, that required vulnerability rather than just security protocols. The reception happened in the same garden, Food catered by Orion's flagship restaurant where this entire story had begun. Dean's trebuchet serving as conversation piece that let people who didn't understand organized crime discuss medieval engineering and architectural principles instead of acknowledging the darker purposes that had brought everyone together. Dean circulated through guests with sketchbook and enthusiasm, showing anyone interested his drawings of the mill's collapse, his designs for improvements to the trebuchet, his architectural analysis of Orion's property that suggested modifications that would improve both aesthetic appeal and defensive capacity. Watching her son be remarkable without fear, be valued without caveat, be himself completely without needing to hide intelligence that made him different. Lacey felt something settle in her chest that felt like peace she'd stopped believing existed. "He's going to be extraordinary," Orion said quietly, appearing beside her with champagne, an expression that suggested he'd been watching Dean with the same satisfaction she felt. Not just intelligent, but genuinely exceptional in ways that will let him build whatever future he chooses. "My organization will give him opportunities most people never access. We'll value his brilliance instead of seeing it as threat. We'll teach him that being remarkable is strength rather than liability that makes you target." Lacey leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of husband who'd become partner in ways that transcended marriage certificates and legal formalities. "You gave him that," she said quietly. "You gave him permission to be extraordinary by protecting him enough that being noticed became safe instead of dangerous. That's the greatest gift you could have given us, not just safety but freedom to be fully ourselves without fear." "We gave each other that," Orion corrected, his arm settling around her waist with possessive comfort. "You gave me family I didn't know I needed. Taught me that vulnerability is strength when it's mutual. Showed me how to build something permanent that has nothing to do with empire and everything to do with choosing partnership deliberately. Dean taught me that intelligence comes in unexpected forms. That courage isn't about violence, but about running toward danger to save strangers. That family is built through shared projects like siege weapons and structural analysis." He pulled her closer, his voice dropping to intimacy meant only for her. "I was isolated before you, Lacey. Powerful but alone. Dangerous but fundamentally lonely. Surrounded by people but connected to none of them. You changed that. You and Dean. You gave me reasons to be more than just dangerous. Purposes that transcend eliminating threats. Family that makes everything else meaningful." They stood together, watching their wedding reception. Watching Dean explain trebuchet mechanics to Marcus, who listened with genuine interest despite presumably having access to more sophisticated weaponry through military training. Watching people who'd become family through unusual paths celebrate partnership built on choice and mutual respect. The garden was beautiful in evening light. The trebuchet was absurd and wonderful. The food was excellent. The company was strange and loyal, and exactly what families looked like when they were built through shared survival, rather than biological accident. "What happens now?" Lacey asked. Not from fear, but from genuine curiosity about futures that no longer involved running or hiding or teaching Dean to be invisible. "After the wedding, after Victor's gone, after we're officially family, what does our life look like?" Orion considered the question with the same focused attention he applied to strategic planning, but his answer came from a place that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with genuine hope for futures they'd build together. "We keep building," he said simply. "You continue architectural work for my legitimate companies. Dean grows up learning everything he needs to be extraordinary. I transform my organization into something less dependent on violence and more focused on building value that doesn't require destroying enemies. We have breakfast together. We work on absurd engineering projects. We create family traditions that have nothing to do with the circumstances that brought us together." He turned her to face him, his expression serious but hopeful. "We build an empire, Lacey. Not one built on territory and violence, but one built on partnership and shared purposes, and raising a remarkable child who understands that intelligence is power when it's applied strategically. We build something permanent that transcends both of us. Something worth protecting, not because it's profitable, but because it's ours." Lacey kissed him, feeling the rightness of this future they were choosing. Understanding that they'd built something rare and valuable partnership based on seeing each other completely, on valuing expertise and intelligence wherever it appeared, on protecting what mattered through combining complementary strengths rather than demanding one person's submission to another's control. "Let's build it together," she said firmly. "Let's create something remarkable, Orion. Let's be the family we chose deliberately, the empire we built through partnership, the future we made possible by destroying what threatened us and creating what sustains us." And standing in the garden where Dean's trebuchet cast long shadows in evening light, where their wedding guests celebrated union that transcended traditional categories, where family had been forged through courage and architectural sabotage, and a child's absolute refusal to let people die when he could prevent it. Orion and Lacey understood they'd built something that would last. They'd built family from ruins of enemies destroyed. They'd built safety from expertise weaponized. They'd built love from partnership, chosen deliberately. And they'd built futures that had nothing to do with violence or fear or desperation that had brought them together, and everything to do with choosing each other continuously, building remarkable lives together, raising extraordinary children who understood that courage came in many forms, and family was what you made deliberately, rather than what you inherited accidentally. It was perfect. It was theirs. It was permanent. And it was just the beginning of everything they would build together, one siege weapon, one architectural project, one shared purpose at a time, creating empire that measured success in joy and partnership, and family that transcended circumstances of its origin to become something genuinely, permanently, remarkably theirs. Forever. If you felt something while watching, please subscribe. That's how I know these stories mean something to you, even on your TV. Take a second to join our community of story lovers. Your support keeps this world of emotions alive.